Okay, continuing with our 8-point checklist, the next thing we can look at is how do you define functions? Ruby calls them methods. I'm not sure why, but when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So we're going to call them methods. And because Ruby is object-oriented, there are class methods and instance methods. Every method, by the way, is one of those two things. You might think that you're just defining a method and it doesn't really belong to any class. It always belongs to some class. Even if you're in the read-eval print loop where you're just typing lines of code, there is an object whose value is the current interpreter and the class that represents the interpreter scope. So you might just think you're defining a function that doesn't belong to any class, but it always belongs to a class. You cannot throw a rock at Ruby without eventually hitting object orientation very, very soon. So let's take a look at some of this. Instance methods and class methods, the syntax for defining them is very similar. The value of calling a method is the last expression evaluated in the method. This is really important because here's an example method I defined, because all sample methods are called foo, of course. This method takes a required argument x. It takes an optional keyword argument y, which if I don't pass a value for y, it will default to 1. And it just returns an array of these two expressions. That means that if I call it with 3 and I specifically pass a value of 5 for y, I get this. If I call it with just 3, then y defaults to being 1 and I get this. Notice that I can also omit parentheses. This is sometimes called poetry mode. The basic rule is parentheses can be omitted if the correct parsing is unambiguous. And we also have an additional rule, which is parentheses can be omitted if it wouldn't be confusing. I like having fewer characters on the page. And if you don't need parentheses, then you avoid parentheses matching errors. And it's very common in Ruby to see parentheses omitted in a lot of contexts. Never do it at the expense of clarity. Okay, so this is sort of the world's simplest instance method of some class, which we haven't talked about yet. If we wanted to define a class method, we would actually put the keyword self, which basically means this is a static method. In some sense, you're declaring the method to be associated with the class as a whole, not something that you would call on instances of the class. We talked a little bit about keyword arguments. Keyword arguments are super useful for methods that have sort of a number of parameters, some of which would default. But as we'll learn later in the course, it's usually in your best interest to minimize how often that happens. Because what you're really doing in that case is you're defining multiple little methods that behave differently. And in that case, you should just have multiple little methods and you can test them separately. Return is optional. So in this method, the last expression that is evaluated is this array. That is what is going to be returned if I don't say anything else. So that's why I say that calling a method in Ruby always results in a return value. Even if you never say return, whatever the last expression evaluated in the function was, that will become the return value. You can say return if you need to short circuit the rest of the function or if you have multiple return points. So the return keyword exists in the language and it does exactly what you'd expect, but it's typical in Ruby that unless a function has to short circuit a return or for some reason use it explicitly, very commonly you won't see the return at all. And as we mentioned, parentheses are usually optional. Be careful when you leave them out, but don't be surprised. If you're reading idiomatic Ruby code, very often you'll see the parentheses not there. And in some parts of the Rails framework, like when we talk about testing, the lack of parentheses is actually used as a way to make the code more readable because you can define little internal domain-specific languages. It's very super cool, but we don't have to worry about that right now. Just be aware that parens are sometimes optional. Everything is an object. This is another one of those things of, please, if you remember only a couple of things about Ruby, remember this one. Everything is an object. Everything, even a lowly integer like 57, 57 is an object. There's a number of methods that 57 responds to. And in fact, the way that you call any method on an object is with a dot. So I can ask nil, for example, which is the special value that represents one of the falsy values. I can ask it if it responds to the method 2s, which is to convert something into a string. I can ask the number 57, what methods does it respond to? This is a weird thing to get used to, but it's actually a really nice simplifying assumption once you get used to reading it. Because once you get used to the fact that everything is a method call, you realize that a lot of things in the language are really just syntactic sugar. For example, if I have some array and I'm wanting to know what its length is, what I'm really doing in that case is sending the method call length to the object called SumArray. If I'm just adding 1 and 2, this looks like a primitive expression, but it's actually not. It is calling the instance method plus on the object 1 and it's providing a separate argument for it, which is the thing to add to itself. This is a very different way of looking at the world than you might be used to. But again, once you get used to this way of doing things, it actually simplifies things a lot because there's very few rules for how expressions are evaluated. Similarly, when I dereference an array, my array sub 4, well, what I'm doing is sending the method call square brackets. Yes, that is the name of the method. And another argument 4, which is the square bracket index, which index of the array to dereference. If I am trying to set an array value to a new value, I am sending the method call bracket equals. Yes, there is a method called square bracket equals, and it is defined on an array collection. And if you pass it 2 arguments, the first one is the array index, and the second one is the new value. What you're used to seeing as an array assignment in Ruby is really just syntactic sugar for this. Everything is an object, and everything is accomplished by calling a method on an object. Even when you do a comparison, like if x double equals 3, I am sending x the double equal operation with an argument of 3. And I am asking x, please compare yourself to 3. This is really important because this means, for example, in some languages, there's rules about type conversion. If you use the plus operator between strings, it means something different than if you use it between numbers, let's say, or if you use it between arrays. Those things are not part of the language in Ruby. They're part of the class definition. So, if I say, quote foo plus 1, what this really means is I am asking the string foo to add 1 to itself. It is up to the string class to decide what that means and if it's even legal for me to do. If I say array x sub y plus array z, I am asking the array x comma y to add to itself the array z. Whatever add means for arrays, it's up to the array class. It is not defined in the language. Which means when you define your own data structures, you can define similar operations on them. For example, if you define a binary tree or something and you want to combine trees, or if you define a matrix operation and you want to define matrix addition or matrix multiplication, it is always up to the class that responds to the method to decide what that method means. So, in these Ruby expressions, 5 plus 3, quote A plus quote B, arrays added together, those are all different methods, right? In each case, it just happens to be a method named plus, but it could be the plus method in the fixnum class, the plus method of the string class, the plus method of the array collection class, and so forth and so on. So, in the category, if you remember only a few things, remember these things, because everything is an object, and because every operation is done by calling a method on that object, whenever you see a.b with or without parentheses, it always means call the method b on the object A. If you're lucky, the object A actually responds to the B method. For example, typically, you're expecting that A is an object of some class. That class implements the B method as an instance method, and so A.b makes sense. Call the instance method B on the instance of the object A. And so we say that hopefully A can respond to that method. And this is one of the, when I said classes are weak and don't matter much, this is actually an example of that. It doesn't matter if you say A.b what the class of A is. Ruby doesn't care. It just cares whether A is an instance of something that can respond to, meaning that it implements the B method. So that's why, 1 plus quote A or adding arrays together, it doesn't matter what the class of the receiver is. All that matters is if the receiver can respond to or implement that operation. In particular, depending on which other languages you're used to, A.b does not mean that B is an instance variable or an attribute of A. It does not mean that A is some sort of data structure and B is one of the members or slots in that data structure. And in particular, in Ruby, expressions like A.b.c are common. What does that mean? It means that A is an object that responds to the B method. And when you call A.b, it returns some other object which responds to the C method. You'll see a lot of constructs like this, and you'd be surprised at the number of cases in which this seemingly confusing thing can actually make code a lot more readable. We'll do some examples later on. So understanding this distinction and remembering this simple rule, A.b always means call method B on receiver A, and all that matters is whether A responds to or implements that method call. That's all you care about. That will save you a lot of time and grief as you start to learn this language.